So, happy Easter! He is risen! Amen. Today we're going to look at the account of the resurrection of Jesus from the Gospel of John. Now, the Gospel of John, which was probably written near the end of the first century, that's a long time after the time of Jesus, and that is even a long time after the epistles of Paul and a long time after the other Gospels were written. So one might say, why in the world would John write another Gospel so late in the first century? The Gospel of John is quite different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They told the story to their audience in their way. Matthew to Jewish Christians, Luke primarily to Gentile Christians and so forth, and Mark to the Christians in Rome. But John has a different rationale in writing his gospel. He says that he wrote his gospel so that people would believe or continue to believe, because they were facing in his era a time of great persecution from the Roman government, that they would continue to believe that Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, and by so believing, having faith in his name, they would have life. He says that's why he wrote his gospel. Now, John's gospel is a theological gospel. Theological gospel, told in the form of a story. For John, hear me, church, theology is more important than chronology. I don't know if you've ever told a story, but I like to tell stories. And I tell stories, and for me they're factual, but I'm going for a punchline, usually a joke at the end of the story. That's just me. So I'll be telling a story about something that happened, and I'm building up the story, and I'm telling it in a certain way so that when I get to the end, I'll get a laugh. And so as I'm telling the story, my wonderful wife will say, "It didn't happen that way." It's like, well, I'm kind of rearranging some of the material here because I got a point I want to make. Well, that's kind of what John did. John puts theology first. He has something he wants to say about who Jesus is, and he's not quite as concerned with historicity or chronology. Not that he ignores them, I don't mean that, but his concern is theology. We might even say Christology. Who is Jesus? Now, if you ever take a class in basic biblical Greek, guess where they'll usually start you with? The writings of John. Why? John's vocabulary is simple. And if you're trying to learn Greek, you might as well learn a very simple vocabulary that John uses. I mean, look, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. See Dick run. It's just a simple vocabulary, but an incredibly complex and deep meaning. It's sort of like I recognize all the words, but when you put them together, I'm not so sure I know what all they mean. So it is a book that is filled with symbol. So John loves to be theological and symbolic and use a lot of imagery, which makes actually reading and understanding his gospel fascinating. So we're going to look at his version of the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and we're going to expect to find some theology, some imagery, and some symbolism. And sometimes it's going to be layers deep. So don't be fooled by the simple words. Let's look for the depth of meaning that John has for us. So with that bit of understanding, let's get the background for our story today. In the Gospel of John, we read of Jesus' crucifixion. We then read that a very wealthy and well-connected politically person by the name of Joseph of Arimathea, undoubtedly a member of the Sanhedrin, who had become a disciple of Jesus, asked Pilate for the body of Jesus from the cross. Now, that was not commonly done. Usually those bodies were discarded, fed to dogs, or just thrown away or thrown into a dump or a common grave. But because of Joseph of Arimathea's political influence, it appears that Pilate gave him permission to take the body of Jesus. So then Joseph, along with another highly influential political person by the name of Nicodemus, also a member of the Sanhedrin, who had become a follower of Jesus, and the two rich guys took the body of Jesus, embalmed it, and it was almost the Sabbath. The Sabbath was coming very shortly, and so no work could be done on the Sabbath. They didn't have time to dig a grave, which what would normally be done from a body taken off a cross. They didn't have time to dig a grave, but the crucifixion took place near a garden. And it so happened, in that garden was a rock-hewn tomb that had never been used. And we can read between the lines of the story and understand it belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. He had had it carved out of the rock side, but neither he nor any of his family had ever used it, so it was empty, an unused tomb. So rather than dig a grave, the Sabbath was almost there. All they had time to do was embalm the body, wrap it, and then put it in this tomb in the garden. Okay? So that's our story. Next, we come to Sunday morning in John chapter 20, verse 1. Sunday morning, John chapter 20, verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. That sounds simple. Let's unpack that a little bit. Early. What do you mean by early? Well, John here appears to use a term from Roman calculation, not the Jewish calculation of sunset to sunset for a day, but the Roman calculation of midnight to midnight for a day. And by early, he means between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. Okay, early. On the first day of the week. Now, what's the first day of the week? Sunday. Okay, wait a minute. Notice that John doesn't say, and on the third day, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, on the third day, John said, no. Sunday. First day of the week. I want you to know that. This happened on a Sunday. Now, you might think, well, what's that? Well, in the book of Revelation, which John also wrote, what does he say? I was in the Spirit when? On the Lord's day, which he means Sunday, the first day of the week. And he went into heavenly worship on the first day of the week, Sunday. So early, between 3 and 6 a.m., on the first day of the week, Sunday, while it was still dark. Why would Mary go out in the dark? And if you read the story, she's got no lamp. At least it's not mentioned. No flashlight, no torch, nothing. She goes out in the dark. What does John mean that she went out in the dark? Well, if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a group of ladies went. For John, Mary Magdalene. Only her. Now, he's not saying other women didn't go. He's just saying, I'm going to talk about Mary. Now, does he mean Mary left home during the dark? Why would she leave home at dark? Is her house that far? A lot of questions here. But for John, it's the dark. Matthew, Mark, and Luke say the women went to the tomb when? Sunrise. John goes, not in my story. In my story, Mary is going to go while it's dark. Why is that? Well, could it mean that Mary lacked understanding at this point? How does John use the terms light and dark in his gospel? Symbolically. Light means revelation. Light means understanding. Light means knowing God. Dark, bad. Ignorance, unknowing, not understanding. All right, so do you get what John's saying? Mary went out while it was dark. What does he mean? She didn't understand. She didn't know what had happened or was going to happen. She's in ignorance at this point. As a disciple of Jesus, she doesn't know. She's in the dark. Now, wait a minute. There's more to this. Do you remember how John begins his gospel? Anybody remember? What are the first few words from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1? In the beginning. Now, where have we read that before? In Genesis 1:1. John 1:1, Genesis 1:1. John begins his gospel in the beginning. John seems to be a fan of the book of Genesis. Okay. In Genesis chapter 1, after in the beginning, verses 2 through 5, Genesis says in verse 2, and darkness covered the face of the deep. Okay? Darkness. It was dark. Then, what did God say? Let there be light. Start in darkness. God's going to say, out of the darkness is going to come light. Verse 4, and God saw that the light was good. Everywhere in the Gospel of John, when you see light, it's good. And, verse 5, and there was evening and morning the first day. I think it's pretty clear to see where John's thinking is, that he sees this story in the light of his reading of the book of Genesis. So we're getting right back to the start of everything. Now, save some of the theology for the end, but you see where he might be going. This is how the world began in darkness, but this is how God brought light. And Jesus is in the tomb where it's dark, but he's going to come out at sunrise to the light. And Mary starts off in darkness, but she's going to come into the light. And it was on the first day. I told you, he's heavy. He had simple words, but a lot of theology behind it. So early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. All right, let's stop again. See, Pastor Dan, you're not getting very far. I'm sorry. Okay. Who was Mary Magdalene? Her name was Mary. Oh, that helps. How many Marys were there? Mary was a very popular name in the days of Jesus. It comes from the Hebrew Aramaic, Miriam, Aaron's sister, or Moses' sister. So that was a popular name for Jewish families to name their daughter, Mary. Now, it's translated over into the Greek of Miriam or Maria. We'd say Maria. It comes from the Greek, Maria, to the Latin, Maria, Ave Maria, to our English, Mary, or if you're a Spanish speaker, Maria. So Miriam, Maria, and Miriam and Maria are both used in the Greek synonymously for the same person, but we're going to call her Mary. Mary was a very common name. This Mary is called Magdalene. Why? Well, to differentiate her from all the other Marys that you run into. She was called Magdalene probably because she is from the city of Magdala. Magdala was a large commercial fishing town where they not only fished, but they also salted the fish and shipped the fish all over the Roman Empire from Magdala. And it was on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. She's mentioned 12 times in the Gospels. Do you realize that's more than most of the apostles? I mean, once you get past Peter and John, and then maybe James, maybe Andrew, Mary is one of the most named characters in the entirety of the Gospels. So she's mentioned by name 12 times in the Gospels. That's more than any other woman other than Mary, the mother of Jesus. And Mary Magdalene is always mentioned first. If there's a list of women, guess who's first? Mary Magdalene. If the men are mentioned, who's always first? Peter. Do you get a connection? The first of the men, Peter. The first of the women is Mary Magdalene. Now, after she'd been healed by Jesus, he cast 7 demons out of her. She became one of his devoted disciples and was one of the many women who traveled with Jesus. Sometimes we forget that he traveled with a group of people, not just the 12, but others, men and women, went with him. And she traveled with Jesus, and according to Luke, she helped support his ministry financially. So what does that tell us? Mary had money. She'd done well. But now she gave up whatever she did. She traveled with Jesus and supported financially his ministry. She clearly was the leading female disciple and a member of Jesus' inner circle. All right, that's who Mary Magdalene was. Back to our story. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Now, one of the Gospels says it was a large stone. Well, what do you mean large? I don't know. If it's more than 50 pounds, to me it's large. I don't think I want to try to lift it. OSHA says I don't have to lift anything heavier than 50 pounds, So how large was it? Don't know. But in addition to it being large, whatever that means, we read in the Gospels that the Roman soldiers sealed it. They sealed the tomb because they didn't want any of the disciples of Jesus taking his body away and making some kind of claim, so they sealed it. So Mary gets there, and the stone over the little opening to the front of the tomb has been moved. She says removed, not rolled away, removed. And the word she uses in Greek is lifted up. Whoa. It means taken up and moved. Now, some of the other Gospels tell us this was done by an angel. John doesn't bother to tell us how it happened. But the stone had been removed from the entrance. So, because the stone had been removed, so she came running. She came running to somebody. Hold it. The stone has been removed from the front of the tomb, okay? What are you going to do? If you'd been there and the stone was removed from the front of the tomb, what would you have done? You would have looked inside. John's Mary? Nope. Now why? Don't know. Could it have been it was still dark? Well, she's in the dark. But she doesn't even look inside. She makes an assumption that somebody has robbed the grave because the stone has been removed. So she came running. Well, I hope it's daylight now. There are little things here that John doesn't bother to tell us, but I mean, if you're going to go running through the countryside out of a garden, I wouldn't do that at night. But anyway, so she goes running to Simon Peter. Why to Simon Peter? Well, evidently he was nearby, probably in the city of Jerusalem. So she went running to Simon Peter. If you read the gospel accounts carefully, it looks like all the others were at Bethany. That's a couple of miles away. So she ran to Simon Peter, who was in the city. And the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. Now, who's this other disciple? Well, we assume that he's in Jerusalem too, because she ran to Peter and to the other disciple. Oh, and the author says, the one Jesus loved. But John's too humble to say that it was him. He just says, I ran to the other one, the one Jesus loved. Thank you, John. And she said, they have, whoa. Who is they? They, and she probably means grave robbers, they have taken the Lord. Okay, now she got that right. She's now calling him the Lord. That's good. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, out of the darkness. And we, excuse me, who's the we? Probably the other women, but John's not concerned about them. So he just says that Mary said, and we don't know where they've put him. And the Greek there could mean buried him. She thinks that grave robbers have taken the body of Jesus, stolen it away, and maybe buried it somewhere else. Now, grave robbing wasn't all that uncommon at the time, especially. These tombs are owned by who? Wealthy people. Common people get a dirt grave. Wealthy people have these tombs hewn out of rock. So you go up to the tombs and you just see what you might find. Maybe they left them some trinkets, some souvenirs, some who knows what's in there. Maybe we can steal the body and hold it for ransom. Who knows? So she assumes that grave robbers have taken the body of Jesus. Do you notice that she's still in the dark? There's no thought of resurrection in Mary's mind. No thought. Grave robbers have stolen the body of Jesus. She's still in the dark. Verse 3. So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. What about Mary? John's like, never mind. I'm telling this story the way I want to tell it. I'm not interested in what Mary did right now. So moving on. So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running. Now listen to this. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. I don't want to brag. I'm not even going to say who it was, but I just want you to know I run faster than Peter. Jesus loved me, and I run faster than Peter. Just want to make these things clear. But I'm too humble to use my name. So he outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Now, John seems to want his readers, who are in the churches that he's serving near the end of the first century in Asia Minor, to know who he is. Jesus loved me. And I was the first to get to the tomb. I was the first to look inside. I was the first to believe. I just want all of you in my churches to know that about me. Okay. So, he outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Now, that may have been because he was younger. I think if you put the chronology together, John was younger than Peter. No, youth doesn't always mean speed, but he could have been just a young man who ran faster. Now, notice what John does, though. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. He bent over. Can we have the slide? Can you put the slide up? All right. He bent over. Do you see why? Do you know how big that opened? Now, notice that it's a cutaway. In other words, it's showing you the inside. So imagine that there's stone all the way around. But look at the opening. The opening is near the ground. It was 3 feet high and 2.5 feet wide. Now, what they did was, if you can see inside, thanks to the cutaway version, you see that little shadow thing there? That's a depression. Now, when the workmen dug the tomb out, they dug a place for them to stand while they hollowed out the inside of the cliff. And they stood there. Now, later, what the practice began, that after flesh had decayed, they would rake the bones off the shelves into the pit. Break them off, throw a new body on, rake the old bones off, throw a new body. And see, there were little ledges. Do you see the ledge? There were little ledges carved, and that's where they laid the bodies. Now, later they decided, well, maybe we ought to take the bones, and they took the bones out and put them in vases and receptacles and whatever. But originally they just brushed the bones off. But that's what the depression is. So once you go through the little opening, 3 feet by 2.5 feet, and that's why you had to bend over to look inside, then you could hop down into that little dugout area and you could look around. Okay. So he bent over and looked in at the strips of linen. Bad translation by the NIV. That makes it sound like bandages and a mummy. No, the Greek is more like a linen sheet, maybe even what we might call a shroud, but it was a linen sheet that he was wrapped in, not strips of linen. So he looked in at the linen shroud, cloth, lying there, but did not go in. Now, he looked in and saw this, so what are we going to assume here? I'm going to assume the sun came up. Otherwise, he can't see in there. It's dark, you know? No mention of lamps or anything. He looks in there, and evidently there's enough sunlight, maybe not a lot, but enough sunlight to see in the tomb. And he sees the linen cloth that Jesus' body had been wrapped in is lying there. Where's the body? Good question. Where's the body? He has not assumed, he has looked, and he has seen the body is not there. So, Simon Peter came along behind him. Behind me. Simon Peter came along behind him, or the Greek could be following him. So Peter's a little slower on the uptake than John, maybe, at this point. Came following along behind him, and he went straight into the tomb. Now, isn't that Peter, from what you know of him? Everybody else stops and looks in. Peter goes, and if you can imagine the tomb the way it looked, he threw himself on the ground, crawled in. I mean, he didn't even stop to look. He just went crawling on his hands and knees into the tomb. But that's Peter. He saw NIV, not strips, but the cloth wrapping of linen lying there, the linen cloth. He saw the linen cloth lying there, as well as the cloth. Now here it'd be better translated by our English word, handkerchief. Literally, it's a sweat rag, but let's call it a handkerchief. As well as the handkerchief that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The handkerchief was still lying in its place, and the Greek here means rolled up. It was lying there rolled up, separate from the linen. Do you catch the significance of this? The linen sheet that Jesus had been wrapped in has been removed. Look, if you're a grave robber, you're going to take that dead body out of the sheet. I think you're going to lift it up with the sheet and carry it out. You're not going to, I don't want to touch a dead, decaying body or take it out in the sheet. No, the sheet has been removed, and the handkerchief over the face has been removed, and they're all lying there very neatly. Okay, can you, grave robbers say, now let's leave the place neat before we go. Obviously, what this is meant to show us is there's not grave robbers here. The sheet was removed, folded up, laid down, the handkerchief over the face, taken, folded, rolled up, and laid in a separate place. Grave robbers would not do this. Something else has happened here. Something else has happened. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, just in case you didn't catch it the first time, not saying who he was, but the other disciple who got there first, also went inside. He saw and believed. I don't want to brag now, but I was the first. I believe. Believed what? I don't know. Believed he had been resurrected? I would guess that's probably what he believed. How far the belief went, don't know, but I would say he at least believed a resurrection had taken place. I mean, they'd seen Lazarus. Of course, Lazarus was raised from the dead, but what we call a resuscitation. He wasn't glorified. Lazarus came back to physical life, lived out his life, and died. But John at least knows that resurrection, coming back from the dead, is possible. He may have not known that Jesus came back glorified, but he knows there's a resurrection. So John believed. And then John adds a parenthetical statement. Remember, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, interesting, had to, is a word that we've encountered before in Greek. We transliterate it in English, D-E-I-D-A, and it means had to, must to. It's the plan of God. It's the will of God. God says this had to happen, so it did. But when they saw what had happened, that Jesus, as far as John knew, had been resurrected from the dead, they still didn't put that together with all the Scriptures. It was only after Jesus had been raised from the dead that they began to look at the Hebrew Scriptures again and go, oh, that's what Jesus meant. That's what he is talking about. That's what the Scriptures say. So they didn't, if you understand this, as far as a witness goes, they did not take his body to fulfill the Scriptures. They didn't even think about that. His body was gone, and so only later did they realize this has fulfilled the Scriptures. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Maybe, I think the NIV probably is wrong here. I think it means, and from the Greek, they went home. Where was home? Galilee. I'm guessing that they said, well, that's it. It was good while it lasted. Jesus lived, he died, now he's gone. Whatever, who knows where he went off to. It's all over, fellows. Let's go fishing. Let's get back to work. We better start earning an income again. And I think they probably headed back to Galilee. Or maybe they went back to Jerusalem. All right, now, John is going to shift gears.